Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this ThinkIn. When we set up Tortoise, Matthew Bosden, Katie Vanek-Smith and I, there was this conversation we had about not what we were trying to do, but how we were going to do it. And we all centered on this phrase that we were trying to set up a newsroom in a spirit of radical optimism. And it's quite easy in these times to have an outlook on life that's anything but radical and certainly short on optimism. But there's something about, and I'm not quite sure exactly why, today I'm struck by that spirit of radical optimism, partly because we started this morning with a ThinkIn with a man called Keith Power, the chief executive of Scottish Power, who has turned what was once a fossil fuels business into a renewables business, and who, when you see him, looks like a chief executive, but actually turns out is a radical optimist, is someone who really is committed to that idea of accelerating the agenda to net zero. And we then ended up having a conversation, one of our open news meetings at lunchtime today, where we were on Twitter Spaces. We were trying it. It was, between you and me, it was actually pretty shambolic. And that's a generous reading of what happened. But in the middle of it, Sharon Redrobe, who runs Twycross Zoo, came on and talked about how you breathe new life into a zoo, its purposes in society, the pressures it faces from the pandemic, but also its responsibility to educate people around climate. And then I come to this at the end of the day, and although this may feel like another one of these Zoom calls to you, to me it feels anything but, because we've never done what we're doing this evening, which is kicking off a coalition that brings together businesses, NGOs, campaigners around climate, and journalists to say, in the course of the next 12 months into COP, and then for the 6 months out the other side, how are we going to think over the course of a year of doing the kind of journalism that really advances the climate agenda, that helps to accelerate net zero? And for lots of good reasons, businesses, NGOs, and journalists often struggle to come together around any particular agenda. The fact that we've done that here really means a lot. I don't know, Tom, whether you're able to bring up the slide that brings together the coalition that started so far. It's actually like one of those sort of weird gatherings where, you know, you step into a restaurant or onto a bus and you see a group of people together and you think, what is it on earth that brings all of these people together? And in this case, if you look at the different companies and organizations, the different industries they're in, the different commitments that they've all made around a whole range of issues, the one thing that does bring them together is they've all made a commitment around accelerating net zero, around delivering on a net zero commitment for themselves and their business, their organization, well ahead of 2050. So it's a significant thing for us to be a part of. And we hope that today, the conversation we have today, is actually part of that coalition building exercise. So all of you here, what our real hope is that you'll come away from today's conversation and think, actually, please join our Accelerating Net Zero coalition. We want to build our journalism, insightful content, and we hope smart conversations around the climate agenda into COP26 and then for the 6 months beyond, because obviously it doesn't either begin or end in Glasgow, it's a staging post along the road. Tom, thank you for sharing that slide. With that in mind, I guess what I really hope we can do is do what we intended with our ThinkIns, which is to hold them as a genuine open news meeting. We're thinking about how we plot the journalism we do for the next 12 months. And I remember 10 years ago, sitting in a newsroom planning the journalism for the London 2012 Olympics. And a year out, we thought, how are we going to do a year of journalism into the Olympics? And I sort of feel there's the same spirit now. How are we going to do the next 6 months into COP and out the other side? And we're really lucky in that Claire O'Neill and in Lorraine Whitmarsh and in Courtney Holm, we have people who are both deep in the weeds, but I hope got a big vision for what we're trying to do in this next coming year. And so we're going to hear from all of them, but critically, we'd love to hear from you. So any thoughts you've got on subjects or stories you think we should investigate, people that we want to hear from, questions that need to be asked and answered. This is the moment to try and bring those together. We will keep a tally of them. My colleague and fellow editor, Giles Whittell, who writes the Net Zero Sense Maker, I hope if you're here today, you're a recipient of the Net Zero Sense Maker, will be, driving all of our journalism in this area. So please do come up with ideas, and we're going to try and bring them all together by the end of the hour. But Claire, why don't you start us? For those people who don't know, we in no small measure have Claire to thank for the fact that COP26 is happening in Glasgow. You brought it here. What's your expectation of what happens in November?
Thank you, James, and thanks for a great opportunity and a really good coalition. So the COP is a very difficult beast to understand. And I think the best way to think about it is a sort of global crescendo moment that happens every year, where there is a core of negotiations that, this year are actually focused on some quite detailed implementation points around the Paris Agreement. There's no great treaty to sign. There's no great jumping off the stage, we all did it moment. But the fact of those negotiations then gives the whole of the world an anchor point to bring forward much more radical climate action and ambition, if you like. But it's always quite hard to say, what does a good COP look like, particularly in a year when vaccine diplomacy is very much the underpinning for a lot of the conversations. I think what we can hope for is a series of what are called nationally determined contributions, basically governments making their pledges as to what they want their greenhouse gas trajectory to look like, that if you add them up, sums to about 2 degrees of warming or less. And where after Paris, if you added up all of the NDCs, we were on for something like a 3.6 degree warming. I think having that sense of framing is hugely important. And by the way, you'll see that I don't say 1.5 degrees. And I think there is a pretty strong body of evidence that while individual countries and certainly many companies are looking to a future that's consistent with a 1.5 degree rise, others are firmly convinced that we've lost that point. But I think on top of that,
Claire, just hold us. Yeah. So what do you think the target should be?
Well, I think we should obviously be aiming for 1.5 degrees, but my sense is that 2, which was the original framing of the Paris Agreement, is where most of the world is going to try and end up. But within that, James, we're only as good as what we then do to deliver against that target. I mean, I brought in the net zero legislation for the UK when I was in office for 2050, which is consistent with a 1.5 degree warming. But the devil is in the detail. What are we actually going to do behind that? And I think what the world is looking for from COP is movement on 3 big things that actually are not officially associated with the negotiations, but they have an ability to happen as a result of that. The first is phasing out coal. Whether or not you're you want to get rid of all fossil fuels and you think we can go to a fully renewable future, the fact remains that coal is responsible for about 30% of our total emissions, and we are still building out coal-fired capacity for industry and power in some parts of the world, and it's a filthy fossil fuel. And as the UK experience shows, we went from 40% coal generation when I first went into politics in 2010 to almost zero now, and we did that through a combination of subsidies for renewables, for using gas, and for air quality restrictions on top of carbon pricing. We've got to get the world off coal, and a serious effort to demonstrate that countries can do it and that global financial institutions are prepared to provide essentially the transition funding we need to get off it will be one thing. The second thing is companies coming forward. I mean, I now work for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's about big global companies who are prepared to make big sustainability commitments. We need this coalition of the willing of big companies and their supply chains to look beyond the net zero by 2050 and to focus on, we want to have negative emissions. We want to capture all the carbon we've ever removed. We want to absolutely drive down our emissions to as close as possible to zero. And that, I think, will happen. And then the last thing is, increasingly the conversation is not about just climate, but about nature. Because what the world has realized that not only do we want to be climate positive, we want to be nature positive. And of course, nature, people think of nature as just a way of solving for greenhouse gases. You know, nature absorbs lots of emissions. It's true, but there's huge biodiversity and actually human benefits from investing in nature. And increasingly, the smart money is bringing together this climate and nature nexus. And I think if we can do that at the COP, then we're starting to solve for multiple problems and coming up with a really interesting array of solutions.
And Claire, can I just pick up on two things on that? On negative emissions, what is there beyond reputation that incentivizes companies to pursue a negative emissions policy?
Well, so it's a great question. So increasingly, so there is reputation, there's also investor pressure. Now, at the moment, investors are using quite blunt instruments to parse up in between. So there's a huge momentum going on in ESG investing, as you guys know, and you've done some fantastic work with your index. When you dig into that, it's not so obvious what companies are actually trying to do. So smart companies are trying to demonstrate and measure and report their emissions and also their emissions reduction. There's also a big market developing in offsets, effectively. These are being seen as an asset class. Even if you can't do it yourself, companies are looking to buy negative emissions. But the most important thing in this, and you mentioned Keith Anderson, who was SSE, is part of the Iberdrola group. You know, one of the reasons that Iberdrola and now SSE are in this incredible space is because of CEO conviction. So all of the amazing company moves, whether it's Unilever under Alan Jope, formerly Paul Pullman, whether it's SSE, whether it's Iberdrola, just boardrooms basically want to do this, and they feel they have freedom to do it in a way that often government and policymakers can't. And the trick is to harness up that ambition and to show policymakers what is possible, because I'm not aware of any government pledging to be negative emissions, and we know of many companies who are actually making that pledge.
Claire, I'm going to come back in a moment, if I might, just to the other side of COP, because and particularly around nature, because I think that's a whole area we're just beginning to think about and probably don't understand fully enough what's feasible, what's reasonable to expect. But I wanted to ask Lorraine Whitmarsh first, if you might. Lorraine, I'm jotting down notes here of, I mean, I'm really cheating here as a journalist, stories we should cover. And I've written down, you know, elimination of coal worldwide, negative emissions, nature. When you're thinking about the next 12 months, what do you think are the areas that really need a much better understanding?
I think for me, it is about the people. And I mean, I think even though a lot of the sort of high level policy discourse is often around kind of the technologies needed to get to net zero, and the fact that we need kind of, you know, renewable energy, certainly we do. We might want to invest in negative emission technologies, and some of the demand side technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps. We do need those things. But actually getting to net zero is going to need people involved in what is an enormous societal transformation. And we're going to need, you know, people's lifestyles to change. We're going to need diet to change. We're going to need to change the way in which we use energy, the way in which we travel, how much we consume, when we consume, how we interact with people. We're going to have to be better at sharing and repairing than we have been in the past. There are really profound shifts already starting to happen and will need to be accelerated in the way we live our lives, the things that we value in our institutions, etc. So I think actually it is around covering some of those broader societal and sort of institutional changes that we're going to need to see. And really, I think spotlighting some of the exciting areas of good practice where people are already starting to adopt some of these kind of different types of behaviors or changing their lifestyles. And I think crucially, highlighting that those things are positive in a broader sense. They're not just reducing emissions, actually they're associated with well-being, with better health, with you know, greater equality, with stronger community cohesion and so on. So I think it's about covering those social, those broader social, environmental, economic benefits associated with the social transformation needed to get to net zero.
And Lorraine, can I ask you about this? So we've kicked off in the sunny spirit of talking about radical optimism. The truth is also we haven't entirely lost our kind of journalistic fight. And about 2-3 weeks ago, we were holding a conversation like this, which was COP26, who are we kidding? And the thrust of it was NDCs are short of where they need to be, the nationally determined contributions. Actually, there's still colossal shortfall in terms of the funding from the developed world to the developing world in terms of what's needed around mitigation. And there is, I think, an understandable public skepticism around greenwash, around the extent to which that people are using climate to serve as a new credential in a public square. So there's quite a deep and understandable suspicion that this is going to be, you know, even taking Claire's point, a crescendo, but not one that delivers nearly enough. And I just want to pick up on your point about people, because it feels as though we're nearing a consensus around climate that says, look, if businesses do enough on electricity, if we think again about the transport sector, if we do enough to refit our homes around heat, then all in all, the actual changes to behavior and consumption that are needed are probably rather limited, are not the great change in individual behavior that perhaps was forecast 5-10 years ago. And I wonder what you think of that.
I just don't think that's credible. I think if you look at the analysis from the UK Committee on Climate Change, they estimate that around 60% of the changes needed to get to net zero will involve at least some degree of consumer behavior change. And that defines behavior change in quite a narrow consumer adoption of new technologies way. So that's 60%. But actually, if you look at what's left over, which is kind of technological change, actually there are people involved in making those decisions about kind of adopting technologies and the extent to which kind of supply side and you know, whether we're going to go with negative emission technologies and so on. So I think it is most of what we need to get to net zero will involve people. Well, all of it will involve people. I think the vast majority will involve behavior change, and it isn't just going to be incremental. It's not going to be kind of small scale things. Even if you just look at electric vehicles and heat pumps, those are going to be pretty disruptive technologies in themselves, but we're going to need to go way beyond those technologies. We're going to need to consume in different ways. We're going to need to move to a much more circular economy, so that we're not consuming so much kind of raw materials, that we're reusing and we're sharing more, we're repairing, etc. We're kind of using secondhand, buying secondhand and selling things on and so on. So I think there are pretty profound shifts in lifestyles that are, it's not going to be about kind of tinkering at the edges.
Lorraine, thank you. As I said, I'm going to come back because I really do want us to make sure we don't lose sight of the other side of COP. But I'm going to ask Courtney Home to weigh in on this. Courtney, before we joined, we were all admiring your loft. There is going to be a lot of remodeling that's considered in the light of bringing you in on this. But I wondered, Courtney, whether you could help us in your thinking, but because I know you've seen this from inside Unilever, you see it now obviously with Capgemini, the way in which you think about this, corporates, governments, and individuals, and how you see those three relating and reacting to each other.
Well, anyone who knows me or has heard me speak before will certainly attest that I think that multilateral collaboration is certainly the way forward. Both Claire and Lorraine are absolutely spot on. Behavior change is really important, and legislation is equally important. I agree with Claire as well. I think 1.5 is probably not within our grasp at this point. I know quite a few scientists that agree with that as well. But I do believe that businesses can start.
I won't interrupt, because I don't know whether you may have seen that someone responded to what Claire was saying in the chat, saying that's quite alarming to think that we've got to the point already, 2021, where we're giving up on Paris and 1.5 degrees. Are you saying that actually we need to be realistic? It's more likely to be 2, and we should accept that rather than try and persuade ourselves that something that's not achievable is?
I mean, gosh, this isn't really a new conversation. We've been having it since Rio, 1993, really. I think we have to avoid 3. I think we need to be pragmatic, and I think we need to avoid 3 degrees.
Right.
Okay. Because we know that climate change turns into something really scary if we get to 3.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I interrupted you answering the question.
No, and the comments in the chat are really good. Really challenging. I'm reading them as we go along. For me, I think what I'm seeing now from a business perspective is we have to get pragmatic. We have to roll up our sleeves. I think we're starting to see a lot of organizations make commitments around net zero, and now it's time for them to write their strategy and their implementation plan and their roadmap. They have to focus on absolute greenhouse gas emissions, efficiency gains, and I think that they have to focus on the how. Hot tip: offsetting is not enough. And I know that it can be done. I've seen it be done, and I think that Scope 3 is going to be a big challenge. I know that the WBCSD and the Pathfinder initiative is we're counting on that to really help a lot of organizations get a handle on, common data models and make it more approachable and easier to implement. For me, it's a pragmatic conversation at business level right now, and it needs to continue to be that way.
And what do you and Courtney, what do you think then of the argument that actually business is well ahead of government in some ways, that you're seeing innovations in businesses that are beyond what's required by regulation? How do you continue to incentivize that? Because sooner or later, customers are not going to be able to distinguish between one company and another's in terms of their climate commitments.
I don't think it's a competition. I think we're all in it together. But what's really important is that I think the governments and businesses have to work together to make sure that the legislation is supporting neutrality. And I think that there's lots of instruments, taxation, carbon capping. There's lots of tools at government disposal that businesses can't do themselves. Claire, I'd love to get your thought on that as well. But I think businesses have to be responsible for their own house, and they have to help the upstream and downstream supply chain with behavior change and reporting as well. Claire, what do you think about how businesses and government can work together?
I mean, so I think you absolutely have to regulate, and you've seen how a little bit of regulation or even threatened regulation, like the phase out of fossil fuel vehicles, which started off as the most humongous row with the auto manufacturers when we in the UK were aiming for 2040. Suddenly became possible, and then you started to see both other countries and other cities committing to closer in phase outs, and then you saw the auto manufacturers responding with complete electrification plans of all of their fleets. So suddenly the possible became the probable. And just responding to the chat, I mean, I absolutely haven't given up on 1.5 degrees. In fact, one of our big operating programs is called SOS, Safe Operating Space 1.5. And as Courtney mentioned, we're doing a lot of work on Scope 3 emissions. But I think we have to face the possibility that we are going to overshoot and think really hard about climate recovery and what happens next, because so many of us are, and we've made net zero 2050 the landing zone. But what happens if we overshoot? And our climate scientists will tell you that, once the ice caps start melting, that tipping point can't be easily stopped, and they're absolutely right. But we don't talk enough about a future that is not 30 years away, but 40 or 50 years away. And what about climate recovery? What is the comfortable space we want? And actually, I think someone mentioned offsets are not enough, but we don't talk nearly enough about carbon removal. So we have wild arguments about mitigation, about carbon reduction, but we don't. And where, for example, are the policy obligations that ask oil and gas companies to put back as much CO2 as they extract into the same rock formations? When I was the energy minister, we were giving companies in the North Sea loads of money to decommission North Sea pipelines without any thinking for how we might repurpose those for carbon capture and storage, either as a regulation or an incentive. So I just don't think we're thinking enough about the what ifs if we overshoot, and how we want to actually pull back.
Claire, I'm going to bring in a bunch of people in a moment. Sorry, Courtney, you're going to respond.
I was just going to say to Claire, I think you've highlighted something really important, and I think where businesses can maybe do a little bit better than government, we can act faster, and maybe we innovate a little bit better as well. I think that businesses we've shown through COVID that we can pivot quickly. And I think government struggles with that a little bit.
And actually, I just want to ask you one thing, Claire, before we start getting lots of voices, because you can see the chat is more than a little alive, is I wonder how you're thinking around carbon pricing or carbon taxes has changed. I think that if I was having this conversation with you even 6-12 months ago, I would have been banging the table saying, what's government's going to do about carbon tax? And my thinking is changing a bit around rules on electric vehicles, rules on home heating. You know, when you talk about, for example, carbon capture, you begin to realize the government does have the power to require a level of carbon capture, to make rules on methane. Do you think that it's within the gifts of government to intervene, to set standards and expectations for businesses that mean that even if you can't come to a globally agreed price on carbon, you can have the same effect through law and regulation?
And it's about, it's about influencing what you can control, James. So, we have no mechanism for a global carbon price. And we're never going to have one, because we don't have a global regulatory system for anything. We have reporting standards, you can get transparency. But if you want to, say, for example, drive renewable heat networks, you can sit in Whitehall and pull as many levers as you like, but government can regulate, they can incentivize, and they can also empower other decision makers, often local authorities, working with business communities to actually deliver on the ground. And so much of this, of course, you need the kind of big policy shifts, but so much of this transition is, let's say we had levelling up towns, with a plan to be completely carbon negative by 2040, and a ton of innovation, private sector innovation, a ton of investment, actually showing what is possible. And that is absolutely within our gift. And before we move on, I just want to throw one other thing on the table, and then I'm going to shut up. But the other group, the other constituency we'd never focus on enough in this conversation is the billion people in the world who don't have any access to anything like what we would consider reliable energy systems. It's the little girls and the women collecting wood to make charcoal. That conversation about accessible, just access, fair access to energy is frankly never played out enough, and the incentives for those policymakers can be very, very different from where we, just with the net zero hat, might like to land.
Claire, thank you. I'm going to touch on that in a moment if I can, but there's so many people who've got points to make. I'm going to come to Judith Smith and to Carol Johnson and to Neil Ross-Russell and Rob Clovance as a sort of first run, if I might. Judith, you, as we got started, made the point that we should dig into housing, and also I think flagged up farming, saying that's not always the most popular subject to weigh in on. But Judith, tell us what you think we should look at on that front.
Well, in terms of housing, I live in a semi-rural area in East Yorkshire, and there's 5,000 new houses being built. Where is the legislation and regulation about how those houses should have sustainable energy built within them? Well, there isn't. They're very small, they're overcrowded, and, it's expected that new residents of those houses will pay for any developments, solar or other types of heating. I think those things should be inbuilt, and I think it's about time, with all these changes in planning, that actually, that should be a standard thing. And secondly, obviously, because I'm in this area, I see time and time again, we've got huge fields with no, bushes, shrubs, they just keep getting destroyed. And I just think every year they come along, they're just flailing all the bushes. And you just think, why is that allowed to happen? Why are the fields just absolutely full of sheep, cattle? They're keeping them in their barns and so on. Some of the practices, they're not good for the environment. They're not good for the future of our country, I don't think. And, we need to have a serious conversation about the way we develop food, the way we manage the land, and as well as obviously the housing issue. Sorry, gone on.
I think it's great. And actually, I'm going to break with a plan that I originally had, because both Courtney and Claire had points, one on housing and the other on farming. Courtney, do you want to weigh in on the housing point? And Claire, I'm going to come to you on the nature and farming point.
I was just going to say, I just said, 2025, and that's when the new legislation on housing is coming through, and I've challenged and said that it needs to be brought forward this week I've challenged, saying it needs to be brought forward. So we're waiting to hear on what that challenge response is from that office. I support you as well on the agricultural stuff. I'm a horticulturalist by training. I've spent many years in greenhouse production, and yeah, I agree that we need to rethink. And I think that a lot of those changes are starting to happen as well. I know Claire wanted to speak to that.
Yeah.
I was loving your backdrop, Judith. You're obviously a great gardener as well. And I actually brought in that legislation. So you're quite right. So I think it is too long. We had massive pushback, unsurprisingly, from the housing industry. So the rule is that no new development can be built with fossil fuel heating from 2025. And there all kind of lots of get out requests over size of development. In rural areas is where I also live. Obviously, a lot of small developments go in, and we wanted to make sure they were captured. I'm told anecdotally it's really stimulating a growth in heat pumps, which is one of the things we wanted to happen, because it's much cheaper to put all that stuff in when you build it rather than retrofit it. But I think there would be, this is a big shift, and I actually don't think many people have realized you will not be able to have a gas or oil boiler in a new home in 4 years' time. That's quite a big shift. Farming, massive, you're absolutely right, massive amounts to work to do, both in terms of carbon storage, because regenerative farming and soil carbon sequestration is absolutely huge, and also in terms of the nature gain, the biodiversity gain. And I'm no Brexiteer, sorry, but I'm not. But one of the actually interesting things that the government is doing is using the opportunity to set our own farming policy. And I actually really commend Zach Goldsmith and the department, what they're doing, and some of the trials that are happening over paying farmers for public goods like carbon sequestration and biodiversity gain rather than food production, and as it used to be hedges being ripped out, is really valuable. And you're absolutely right, we've got an enormous opportunity there.
Claire, thank you. I'm struck, by the fact that it feels, Judith, as though there's a conversation around farming, because we keep coming at it in different ways. We find when we talk about rivers and water quality, it becomes a farming conversation. When we talk about a comprehensive food policy, it's a farming conversation. Where, funny enough, when we talk actually increasingly about politics and we talk about connectivity, it becomes quickly a conversation about farming, and obviously here around energy and climate. So it feels like there's a lot to weigh in on that. I was going to ask Carol Johnson, who was actually talking about regenerative land use, and a couple of other things that actually, to be honest, I didn't even understand, thinking, okay, well, that's good. We should probably look into those. Carol.
What did you mean by what you didn't understand? Biomimicry, maybe?
Sorry, yes. What do you call it?
Biomimicry.
Exactly that. What's that?
Biomimicry is a new process of uniting scientists who study natural processes with corporations trying to solve problems, and taking stuff from nature where the problem's already been solved millions of years ago often, and using it. A great example from the UK is when they first started doing the massive wind turbines, they had a terrible hum that drove everybody nuts. Mm-hmm. And somebody asked the right question, which was, what in nature moves through the air silently? Owls. So they studied owls' wings and applied what they learned to a new generation of the big vanes on the turbines, and it works. So that's an example of biomimicry. It's tremendously helpful, and it's a wonderful way to illustrate. And you can just Google it or YouTube it, and you'll come up with all kinds of cool stuff that's happening. But the main principle here that I was pointing out is that if we start shifting the way we're trying to think about these problems to asking, what can we learn from nature's own processes, which are already sustainable and regenerative, and how can we apply them to everything that we do? Everything will be solved. And it's a lot of fun. I get so much energy from seeing the people doing that. They just love it. Green building practices, as I said, biomimicry, and in business, it's all kinds of stuff going on.
Carol, one of the things I should say, there's this really lovely thing, I think. I mean, there's a lot that we miss about not being in the same room together. But one of the things I love about doing these calls on Zoom is that I sit with that gallery view, so you can see everyone. And at the exact moment that you said, owls, everyone smiled. The whole screen just lit up with everyone smiling at the same time. So I see that someone who's going by the name of I did it, we did it, you did it, says we've got to have a ThinkIn on biomimicry, which we will do in some form or other. We will get to the bottom of biomimicry. I want to bring a couple of other points in, if I might, before I come back to Lorraine and Courtney and Claire. Rob Clovance, you came up with a point about ESG police. Forgive me, it's a slight handbrake turn here, but the point about what companies are claiming on ESG and whether or not it's relevant and true seemed quite important. So I just wondered, and you said that you were a journalist in this area. There you are.
Yes.
What would the ESG police do? You know,
well, the police is a strong word. I sent it in there. I put it in there to be somewhat provocative, and I think the problem is that there's a lot of doubt in terms of what corporations are saying they're doing from an ESG perspective, how much they're regulated in terms of, and how much even their shareholders hold their feet to the fire on these things. What I'm thinking of is there a body that is outside government that could monitor the claims and keep a better eye on these companies? Because there's been a big shift here. I'm in Canada, and in North America, there's a huge shift towards investment in that. And I've seen it happen dramatically during the pandemic, which is a great sign. We just want to make sure we're investing in the right companies. If that's happening, that it's going to the right places. And obviously the environmental part of ESG is huge. And as we come out of the pandemic, you can only imagine what's going to happen in terms of consumption, from travel to the purchase of products to everything. We need to get this right. We need to make sure that these companies that claim they're doing the right thing are actually doing it. And I really don't know how we monitor that and how much we have to just rely on government and shareholders to do that for us.
Lorraine, can I ask you, is there a benchmark, an independent oversight body that you trust the consumer that gives you the capacity to measure whether or not a company's ESG claims are relevant and true?
I'm not aware of such a thing, and I think and I do think this is a really, really important point. And I think, like, if you're looking at the role of journalism, this could be a really powerful thing that you could do, actually, is to put in context those claims made by companies around, you know, that they're investing in this. But okay, but if that's only 1% of their entire investment portfolio and the rest of it's all in fossil fuels, let's say, then that needs to be called out, I think. And yeah, so I do think that's a really important role for the media. Because, and I think as well, this one of the most effective and immediate things, according to analysis, that can be done to stimulate a net zero transformation is carbon disclosure, is just showing how much impact that companies have in terms of their contribution to climate change. I think that would change what companies are doing, but it would also change what consumers are doing, and give them better insight into the impact of the products and services that they're buying. So I do think this is a big topic. Yeah.
Lorraine, thank you. I mean, just forgive me, this is a little bit boastful, but we at Tortoise set up the Responsibility 100, which was exactly an attempt to do that, to try to measure the FTSE 100 companies against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And actually, it's Alexandra Musavizadeh, my colleague, who with a team of people are trying to measure the talk of companies versus the walk. And the reason why I mentioned relevant and true is that, of course, there's also a spewing of data that is kind of interesting, but not particularly illuminating. It's not necessarily relevant. And then there's a separate question, which is what's also true. So I do think you're right. It feels as though for us, we've now got the Responsibility 100, we've now got the Climate 100, that is a real job for journalism. There's a kind of healthy skepticism there that we should bring to interrogating that. Sorry, Courtney, you wanted to come back in. Courtney, you're muted. There you are.
Just thinking, thanks, sorry. Just thinking about businesses. I mean, I think that it's also important for us to think about how organizations can support this as well, and making sure that if they're buying stuff from suppliers and they're holding suppliers accountable for meeting commitments, that there's a contractual framework. There's a brilliant NGO that we've been working with called the Chancery Lane Project. Pro bono lawyers have put time and energy into creating clauses that can be used in contracts. And then there's smart tools, you know, and smart contract tools that you can do to manually or automatically hold people account through contracts. So I think that there's a lot of, again, pragmatic technology solutions for this sort of stuff at business level as well. So it's not just on indexes or government, but also business and supply chain as well.
Courtney, thanks. Claire, I'm going to come to you in one moment, but I just want to get two elements of the sort of business world that we don't always hear or see from. I want to hear from Neil Ross Russell, because full disclosure, we've known each other for years, and if you want to take some encouragement from the direction of travel in terms of climate, the fact that both he and I have got religion on net zero is probably an encouraging sign. So he set up Net Zero Now, which is around small businesses. Neil, do you want to talk a bit about this? Because I think it's much easier if you're a big multinational to say we're making these commitments and have a sustainability team, et cetera, et cetera. What do you see, or what do you hear from small businesses when they're asked to make changes on this front?
Well, I think the reason we've set up Net Zero Now is in response to everything we've just been talking about. I mean, that triumvirate of corporate, government and individuals is all well and good, but within that corporate section, the 99% of businesses by volume, 60% of employees work for SMEs who very, very often will find that going net zero is totally out of their reach. They don't have the resources to calculate, to reduce, to offset all those good things that you need to do to get there. Yet that radical optimism we were talking about at the start exists throughout that long tail of businesses. So what we're trying to do, at the risk of sounding like too much of an advert, but what we're trying to do is work with industry bodies, because it needs to be very sector specific, to develop in a sort of open source process, peer review process, a set of sector specific guidelines that will help SMEs answer the right questions using the right language to get to a position where they can achieve that net zero status. Because we're talking about pushing things down the supply chain and making sure that these big companies are not just doing it for themselves, but encouraging their supply chain to follow suit. But that can't happen at the moment because they simply don't have the resources and the capabilities to get there.
And Neil, is the deal with small and medium-sized companies that when you say they don't have the resources, they don't have the money to go and commission a report on their own carbon footprint, or there's actually not a body of, if you like, small-scale auditors who can go in and provide that on a 6 to 10 person business, one after another, at the scale that's needed? Is it a supply problem or is it a funding problem?
It's a bit of both, really. The supply problem is there because, quite rightly, people are focused on the biggest sinners in this world at the moment. I mean, that makes total sense, right? If you're trying to have the biggest impact, you focus on the big guys. So that's where the market is focused at the moment. But the point is, or the truth is, once you look at SMEs within a sector, I mean, we've just announced a net zero pub protocol that we're doing in conjunction with Coca-Cola, for example, which is developing a set of protocols. We're just going through pilot stage at the moment, that will allow individual pubs to go onto the platform and just going through answering the right questions, understandable questions that the pub manager should be able to do. I mean, they're detailed questions to understand where their emissions are and to calculate those emissions, to come up with their own emissions reduction strategy, and ultimately go all the way through offsetting. And achieving that net zero status. So yes, the solutions are there, but it just needs to be structured in a way that makes it easy and simple for these SMEs to get their head around and actually do it.
Okay, Neil, thank you. Another group that's also sort of obviously massively important, but quite hard to hear from, are the investor side of it. And I saw Barbara Ridpath's comment. Barbara, I don't know whether you're there about sort of wading through ESG statements. You sound as though you're speaking from the heart there. I just wonder, Barbara, just tell us a little bit from the investor point of view, what you see in terms of a real willingness to respond to your expectations on environmental outputs by companies. How much investors you feel really do have leverage now?
Oh, I think there's a huge difference, but I think the nature of this conversation demonstrates that most companies have realized that investors mean it. And
Right.
some of them are still greenwashing, but increasingly they are taking this seriously. And I continue to be amazed for something like the Sustainable Development Goals. They're better at subscribing to them than the governments are. You know, they're getting religion about this because they're realizing not just investors, but consumers want it. And we're putting our money where our mouth is. James knows what I do, but you know,
Barbara, tell everyone.
Well, I run the Church of England's Ethical Investment Advisory Group on how we decide where the church's money goes, and that's pretty contentious, so I've got to be careful. But the point is, people like you and me with our individual money aren't going to make a difference, sadly. But people with significant institutional money in pension funds and the church and other places that vote according to their consciences are beginning to make a real difference in the way this money moves. And, you know, it's a big deal.
But how much should I worry, Barbara, that the investment world is itself a bit too fragmented?
Oh, I don't think it's the fragmentation. I think it's how much the investment world is paid.
Say again. Okay, go on.
I think that industry itself needs some looking at.
Don't stop there. Keep going.
Well, it's just, you know, the reason they're doing it is because they realize their clients want it. That's a great thing, right? If that's what their clients want and they're doing it, that's terrific. But looking at the economics of how that industry works is something that responsible investors should also be doing.
Okay, it seems as though that might be a whole, I was going to say another thinking, possibly a series. All right, well, thank you very much indeed. Before I go back to Claire and Courtney and Lorraine, I just wanted to go to Laura Godfrey, because I think there is, you know, Laura said something very early on about Amsterdam and, you know, transforming transport systems, but also about the way in which we change, you know, our own individual behavior. Laura, I don't know whether you're there and able to weigh in. Laura, oh, you've just dropped off, I fear. Okay, well, for give you that. Let me, if I might, just ask Courtney and Lorraine and Claire just to help us with some concluding thoughts. Because, Courtney, if you had a blank canvas from here, not just into COP, but the 6 months beyond, if you were trying to plan for what we need to see and what we need to be looking into from November through to next summer, what would you focus on?
Well, first, just Laura Godfrey was talking about donut economics,
Right.
and Kate Rathworth's book. So Amsterdam's trying to, they're doing a project on it. Anyway, what would I do? From a business perspective, I think it's important that we get serious about making commitments to embed sustainability into our operations, and report on what we're doing so that we can continue to make improvements and enhancements at operational level, and focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for sure. I think that's where I would, the next 12 months, that's what we need to do.
And what about, can I just ask you to pick up on Ashton Shuttleworth's point, which is, I know he's pointed it at Barbara Ridpath, but actually one of the questions here is about whether or not our expectations of business are misaligned to our interest. We had Mark Carney come and join us, 6 weeks ago, and his whole book is an argument that we've got a misalignment between value and our values. And Ashton Shuttleworth makes the point, and so I'm speaking for you, Ashton, but your point is that, you know, that fiduciary responsibility has become the overriding obligation on the executive board, and whether or not we change that. Courtney, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, no, I think businesses care about two things. I think business cares about what their competitors are doing and what their consumers want. So I think if consumers speak with their wallets and with their voices, and competitors start to make moves, then other businesses will follow the journey and the path. And I think that organizations have to take accountability for what they're putting out in the market and how they're behaving and what their supply chains are doing.
Okay, Courtney, thank you. Lorraine, how would you direct us if you had, group of different, we've got data researchers, we have obviously the capacity to commission, opinion research pieces, we've got, Giles and the team doing a weekly look at what is and isn't true in terms of commitments on net zero. We've got the Responsibility 100, and we have the capacity to hold these kinds of think-ins where we do stop and discuss separate issues, inter COP, at COP, beyond COP. What would you urge us to do?
Yeah, and I'm delighted to hear that you've already started doing the calling out, and apologies, I wasn't aware of that. I think, so lots of that would be great. I think it's great to hear you have kind of polling capacity, because I think one thing that you can do is then to, I guess, gauge public views about different policy options and technologies as well, but and get a sense of really what is important to people, what they're concerned about, and what they'll support, and then kind of hold a mirror up to society to actually show, hey, actually most people are really concerned about climate change, and they really will support pretty bold policies, at least, with certain kind of caveats, etc. But there is support for bold climate action, actually. And so showing that back to the public, but also to policymakers, to businesses, to that triumvirate, to actually show there is demand here, there is a call for change, and getting more insight into exactly what will and will not be supported, I think is a good thing you can focus on. And I think in terms of some of the kind of things that you can focus on in future think-ins, it probably is about kind of digging into sort of more of these really good examples of innovation at the local level. I mean, someone mentioned Amsterdam, but there's lots going on within this country as well as other countries to actually bring about net zero transformation at the local level. And so what that looks like, and how are people changing their lifestyles, how are cities being transformed, and so on, and how is it improving life for people? I think the positive stories that can come out of that can be really empowering. So yeah, lots more on, I think, the changes that are starting to happen, and how can we upscale those really good examples.
Lorraine, thank you. It's really interesting, isn't it, how much more, if you like, technocratic journalism becomes a response. You're really trying to understand the nuts and bolts, the engineering of things in a way that possibly doesn't sit. People often talk about a lack of scientific skills amongst journalists, but there's also a kind of mindset here, isn't there, which is, how do you think about systems and system change when we've often thought about stories? It's, as you can hear, I'm sort of trying to process it as you said. Claire, I'm going to come to you for a final thought for mine. Yeah. Okay, you are, well, given the amount of work you've done with us, the truth is we're already doing a lot of things that you think we should be doing. So tell us the next 10 things we think we should be doing.
So I just want to go back to what I think was a really interesting thread of conversation about the numbers and how you avoid the kind of green BS that is flopping around in this space. And the truth of it is, there is a lot of that, and we need to do a couple of things, some of which we're doing. So if you think about I'm sure there's lots of people out there who run businesses or have financial literacy, but when it comes to kind of cash accounting, we have an agreed set of rules for cash accounting that broadly correspond globally. And if a company wants to list on a particular exchange, or a government wants to raise money, they know they have to stick to those rules. We have a bit of that framework. It's called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and WBCSD helped write it originally. And it gives you things like scope 1, 2, and now scope 3 emissions definitions, and we're working to update it. We have lots of people out there, though, who want to say how much a particular cash or carbon a company or a sector should make, which is rather unusual because we don't tend to dictate what companies or sectors can make in terms of their returns. And indeed, and this is part of the battleground, if you like, in the greenhouse gas space, how much emissions can oil and gas sectors make, how much do they need to offset? And that's a very ideological, I think, debate, but also one that is fraught without numbers. But the bottom line is, we can probably all quote more or less accurately the daily case rates and death rates for COVID in the UK. I want to say it's like 5,000 cases and less than 10 deaths. We should be able to quote on a daily basis the Keeling curve, because ultimately we have a measure of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. In fact, it's about 419 parts per million now. It's up at the highest it's ever been. And by the way, it's gone up 50% since we all started jawing about greenhouse gas control back at the first Rio Earth Summit. And we just don't put enough numbers around this. So ultimately, And this is why this is good, because this is a numerical problem to solve. We know we should be able to say how much greenhouse gas we're pumping out, and we can say what's happening in the atmosphere, and we have to solve for that area under the curve. So that gives me a great sense of comfort. And of course, there are then lots of other questions which we started to touch on, like just transitions and equality, etc. But it's all about the numbers. And I just want every day, the UK government should stand up every day and say, today, the best estimate of our greenhouse gas emissions is X. And by the way, it's down. The last time our emissions were this high, Queen Victoria was on the throne, and we can all argue about whether we've exported it. But we are almost innumerate, I think, when it comes to the biggest numerical problem of all. So call out the bullshit. Call out the companies as you're doing. Let us all understand what good and bad looks like, but let's turn this into the world's biggest numerical problem to solve, which is essentially what we do with COVID. And then I think we start to make progress.
Okay, well, Claire, thank you. I love that. Your last thought about the Keeling curve puts me in mind of the fact that when I used to work at the Times, of course, you could make many changes to a newspaper, but you were really in trouble if you messed with the weather. And we had a tiny little icon that sat just below the masthead. That was the weather forecast today. And it was it was an icon.
Yeah.
And I will talk to John Hill, who's our genius designer, to see whether or not what we can do on the Tortoise website is just give you the daily Keeling curve number. So rather than being a newsroom that tells you the weather, we will tell you the climate. And if we're in that spirit, we're on the right track. I see that our hour is up. I don't know how it disappeared quite so fast, but I want to just say two things. One is, as I hope you've seen from this hour, the idea of our coalition Accelerating Net Zero is genuinely to be open. We often talk about being a slow newsroom. What we realize more and more is that being open is really the key to what we can do and do differently. So if you're interested in the coalition on Accelerating Net Zero, do get in touch with me. Just drop me an email, james@tortoisemedia.com. My colleague, Gurjinder Dhaliwal, who's here too, Gurjinder has been bringing together, a host of different companies that are supporting us. It really makes a difference in terms of what we can do, as well as NGOs and campaign organizations. So I'm sure that many people here in a personal capacity are involved with those organizations. Please do get in touch with us. There you see Gurjinder's just said, hello, and say, do get in touch with us. We would love to build this coalition so that by the time we get to Glasgow, it's a real body of different organizations with different interests and different outlooks on the world, but united in an interest in accelerating net zero. And journalistically, I can't thank you enough, because I come away from this with, actually, I went in with 3 sets of interests. How do we think about businesses? And we thought about investors and SMEs and negative emissions. How do we think about governments? How do we talk differently about carbon and coal and changing expectations around things like housing and heating? How do we think about people and personal behavior and the incentives that will fundamentally change personal behavior? But the thing that I love is I come away with a 4th, which is how do we think about nature? And beyond business, beyond government, beyond people, we think about nature. And I suppose I will never look at an owl quite the same way again. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. A big thank you to Courtney Holm, to Lorraine Whitmarsh, and to Claire O'Neill. We can't applaud you, but we can thank you and wish you a very good, wherever you are in the world, afternoon, evening, rest of day. Thanks so much for joining us.